Evening all, and welcome to the latest ADU War Study Seminar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Associate Professor Garth Pratton, one of the historians from the Strategic and Defence Study Centre. Our seminar tonight is a truly international affair. I'm zooming from Hanoi in Vietnam. Our speaker, Dr. Klaus Schmider, is joining us from his home near Camberley in the United Kingdom, and he's going to be talking about German history. Klaus is an old friend and esteemed former colleague of mine. A decade ago, we worked together in the Department of War Studies at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where Klaus has been a member of staff for over 20 years. One of the topics on the War Studies syllabus at Sandhurst was, and I suspect still is, the writings of Clausewitz. In talking about Clausewitz's description of war as a rational act, students often respond to me with, well, what about Hitler? To which then I respond, well, we don't have to agree with the reasoning or its conclusions, but we have to understand that usually there's a process there. There's, very few instances of, unreasoned violence when we're talking about war. We need to step outside our values and assumptions to understand why wars unfold as they have, and this is where Klaus is coming from tonight. Too often, Hitler's decisions are presented as those of a crazy man, and also with the benefits of knowing how the story ended. In his newish book, Hitler's Fatal Miscalculation, wave the book, Klaus, which Klaus also tells me is soon to be released in a paperback edition. Klaus seeks to understand Hitler's seemingly irrational decision to declare war on the United States by examining just the information available to him in December of 1941 and resist what he described to me last night as the urge to cheat, that is, to peek into the future. What Klaus proposes is an explanation more nuanced and with more explanatory power than a story of a madman bent on self-destruction. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Klaus. There'll be time for questions at the end, and if you could put your questions in the chat box. So over to you, Klaus.
Yeah, thank you, Garth. Good evening, Canberra. Feels odd saying that, but I'll get my head around it eventually. A great honor being here. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I think without further ado, I would like to take my cue from my host, essentially to lay to rest this idea that declaring war on the United States was literally just, you could say, a madman's suicidal urge. Now, just to get essentially one thing straight, this is arguably the one chapter where actually I had some outside help, where I was actually able to stand on the shoulders of a predecessor, and that's essentially the man's health, the physical, not the mental health, in case you were wondering. Ever since 1994, we have known that Hitler was mortally ill with Parkinson's disease. I say this guardedly. Why? Because the revelation hasn't really penetrated very, very far. Possibly because the discovery was made over the course of several years, and with, you could say, a lot of backbreaking work, which must have taken hundreds of woman hours in this case, by a neurologist at Cologne University, Ellen Gibbels. And she basically did something truly remarkable. She took the time to examine every single visual image, film image that is, which we have of the German leader for the period of 39 to 45. And she analyzed these snippets out of chronological sequence. Now, with most of us, that wouldn't work, of course. That wouldn't work with the historian, because we generally know that essentially if it's meeting on the Babelage and it looks like the Wolfschanze and it's early autumn, it's the September 44 summit. So in a way, we couldn't help ourselves. We would know immediately when this happened. She didn't. She doesn't have this sort of background. So she basically analyzed these, you could say, brief appearances before the newsreel cameras out of chronological sequence, and was able to prove, insofar as it is possible to reach, you could say, medical conclusions without the patient being there, that he was mortally ill with Parkinson's disease. And what I find rather astonishing is that very few historians have actually acknowledged this major breakthrough. Now, question before us, of course, is, could he have known of this? Could he have known of this at the time? Could he have known of the fact that he was mortally ill with Parkinson's around the time of Pearl Harbor? Because that essentially puts a completely different perspective on things. All of a sudden, he might have a reason to bring the house down around him. But I must say that based on the evidence before me, and I've got a chapter on this, like I said, I was able to stand on the shoulders of the predecessor. The credit is really for Ellen Gibbels's, not mine, that he was not in a position to know. Okay, he was not in a position to know, and I think the most conclusive proof we can get from his head physician's notes from 1944, 45, because back then his condition deteriorated with every passing month. And there was no reference to an earlier Parkinson diagnosis, not even a tentative one. He was clueless, and Dr. Morell was just as clueless, which in and of itself is an interesting thing to ponder. But basically, I would say it's pretty conclusive that he was not conscious of the fact that he was living on borrowed time. If, say, Germany had won the war, he would have died around 1952, which is exactly the year which, interestingly enough, C.J. Sanson picked for a counterfactual novel. I mean, there Hitler dies in 1952. Anyway, moving on. Now that we have disposed of this urban myth that essentially the German dictator did us all a favor by essentially indulging in an act of self-obliteration, what's the rationale behind declaring war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor? Well, crucially for that, we need to look at US-American relations, which, of course, if we took it back all the way to 1939, would take us most of the morning. So let's just focus on spring, summer, autumn of 1941. And it's true. I mean, this period sees a marked deterioration in German-American relations, crucially with the passing of the Lend-Lease Act, which Hitler, for one, recognizes as something of enormous importance. Most of his senior aides don't, which is the interesting thing. And then it goes on from there. There's the occupation of Iceland, there's the closing of German consulates in the United States, there's the escorting of British convoys halfway across the Atlantic. And crucially, at least in my opinion, this is the absolutely crucial point, dismantling neutrality legislation, which had basically said you cannot take American goods in US bottoms into British ports. And that was finally dismantled on November 13th. Now, for that, we have to realize that as far back as 1939, in a tete-a-tete with his senior henchman, Hitler had said, I mean, I know the Americans are making lots of noises and they're certainly not our friends, but we are still safe. I seriously doubt they will break cover and join our enemies, at least until such time as they dismantle the key articles of the neutrality laws. And this was back in November 39. So come November 41, the key articles of the neutrality law fall by the wayside, and you see him genuinely confused and at a loss which move to go for next. And we've got a pretty good idea of his thoughts around this time, because we have a number of key sources like the Köppen reports, the Goebbels and Rosenberg diaries, conferences with Ribbentrop, and such like. There is really not, and he really does pick up when he receives the offer of a Japanese alliance. I mean, you can really follow this. If you take a very close look at the chronology, you can see him despondent, confused, clueless even, once he receives the news of the Americans passing the changes to the neutrality law. And then all of a sudden upbeat when the Japanese offer an alliance, because the way he saw it, well, once the Americans pass the neutrality laws, we're done for. We'll be at war with them in 6 months or so. Why is that? Well, it's mostly, if you take a closer look, it's mostly to do with the fact that the American president, in his uphill fight to pass laws that will in some shape or form favor the British, always gets a break whenever an American merchantman is torpedoed on the high seas. Happened 4 times in 1941. At least 4 times you could say that made a blip on the political radar screen in Washington. And this actually makes a difference. The funny thing is that when German U-boats put torpedoes into US Navy vessels, that essentially does not generate outrage. And that's the sort of difference which is essentially carefully noticed in Berlin. I can actually prove it because happily I've got, you could say, a brief passage in the memoirs of a Gauleiter to that effect. Basically Hitler in the last days of November 41 says to a group of them, sooner or later it's going to happen. We'll carry on torpedoing American merchantmen. Sooner or later, one of them is going to be a passenger liner. Sooner or later, we'll have another Lusitania incident on our hands. So happily, you could say, I can actually prove this case. Until now, you could say the people who came before me, by and large, had refused to essentially nail their colors to the mast, if I could be forgiven the quip, in essentially putting it down to a very specific cause. And I'd say it's definitely the changes made to the neutrality law when Congress dismantles the last article on November 13th. That's essentially not before, not any sooner, where Hitler reaches the conclusion, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. Essentially, I'll never be rid of these guys. Chances are I'll be at war with them in 6 months' time. So what do I do next? Okay, moving on. We need to look at the partner in crime, of course, the Imperial Japanese. Now here, God, this is the biggest chapter in my book, okay? The biggest chapter, and it was a real education. I never thought that I would find myself in a position where I would actually commiserate with a senior Nazi functionary, but I did, okay? I did. When you go through the records of the German Foreign Office and you read the reports of the ambassador in Tokyo, Eugen Ott, you can't but essentially feel sorry for the man. Because after all, an ambassador, when everything is said and done, is somebody who has to read the situation in his host country, interpret certain actions, pass on the information to his bosses, see if it does any good, receive instructions in turn. Now, what you have to realize is that the Japan of the 30s and 40s is easily the most dysfunctional society of the developed world. I mean, by a country mile, okay? Where as far as things like accountability and transparency is concerned, Japan is basically, I'm not sure what kind of state to liken it to. I mean, a collection of Somali warlords comes to mind. What basically you're dealing with, if you are the German ambassador in Japan in 1941, is a whole host of power brokers, whether Army, Navy, Foreign Office, Imperial Palace, making a path to your door and making totally contradictory commitments about Japan's future course of action as a member of the Tripartite Alliance. And this actually, you could say, reaches its absolute peak when in the late summer of 41, the military attaché at the Berlin embassy visits German Army High Command and basically tells him without any buts, ifs, or howevers attached, that yes, Japan is getting ready to essentially invade the Soviet Far East, and that the Kwantung army is girding itself for battle, that they're moving into position. And it's really just a matter of, well, of deciding whether it's going to be this week or next. And this is somebody who's the lieutenant general. I mean, we're not talking about a lance corporal in his cups, okay, discussing this matter. I mean, this is essentially, you're getting intelligence from the horse's mouth. And we have got a very, very extensive report on this encounter from a German officer who was no doubt furiously scribbling notes because he couldn't believe his ears. And as you essentially progress down this document, the exclamation marks in the margins keep getting bigger with every paragraph, as in, is this really happening? Or alternatively, is this guy essentially living in some sort of parallel reality? And it turned out that it was a parallel reality. Essentially, if you are the German ambassador in Tokyo, you can't take anything seriously anybody ever tells you, okay? Because it's not just the case of the army taking a different point of view from the Navy, it's also a case of different cliques within the army or even within the Navy having totally different and even mutually exclusive opinions on a number of absolutely crucial matters of foreign policy and strategy. To top this all, of course, essentially the one individual who looked like he might confer some rationality, some consistency to this process, Yosuke Matsuoka, who was prime minister until July 41, gets unceremoniously dismissed because he's seen as too much of a loose cannon by most of his fellow establishment players. And loose cannon in the Japan of the time, that is quite a yardstick. I mean, you really need to excel at that in order to make it to the very, you would say, leadership of the pack. So essentially, the Germans might as well have closed down their embassy or keep a skeleton staff in place and limited themselves to the reading of tea leaves. When finally, you could say that the Japanese commitment that says, we are going to break cover and it's going to happen at this time and we're going to attack the Americans and the British, the Dutch and the Australians. When that finally comes, I mean, Ott is essentially at a point where he just passes this up to Berlin and says in so many words, listen, this could be the real deal. It could just as easily be total hogwash. I mean, it's basically a coin toss. I'm no longer in a position to offer an opinion. Now, the thing is that you might well say, and this is the obvious question to ask, that seeing as the Japanese did not make their entry into the war conditional upon the Germans declaring war on the United States first, why didn't Hitler just sit back and enjoy the show? Because if this was all about distracting American assets, well, this had just been delivered free of charge. It's not like he had to do anything. I mean, the Japanese were committed, right? And this is the only point I would say where ideology comes into the equation. Other than that, this entire process is about making, you could say, decisions that belong in the sphere of military strategy. But just this once, ideology, in this case, National Socialist ideology, is going to rear its ugly head. Why? Because I've got some pretty good indicators. I can't say absolute, you could say bone-crushing proof, but I've got some pretty good indicators that basically tell me that people in Berlin were convinced that the Americans might offer the Japanese a Munich-like deal that would have allowed them to keep a part of their early conquests in Southeast Asia in return for bringing peace back to the South Pacific. And this, of course, this is totally bonkers. I realize that. That's why I said, I mean, this is why ideology, in this case, contempt for a supposedly weak democracy enters what is otherwise a military strategic rationale. They are convinced that essentially, what with the Japanese on the rampage, what with the Japanese having crippled half the US Navy battle line, the Americans will probably tell them, listen, we get it, you're angry, please get in touch with your inner feelings. Here is half of the Dutch East Indies for you. Can we be friends again? And that's exactly what the Germans are actually fearing until about Christmas 1941. And that is why they feel they have to go rushing in and commit to this war and mail a declaration of war of their own to Washington to make sure that those elements in Tokyo that weren't happy about the war to begin with will stay committed. That is the one part of this entire process you might quite rightly call completely insane. Okay, the one other loose end I need to mention in this particular context is, of course, why should the Americans not just turn their backs on the Pacific? Okay, the Germans have no guarantee that the Americans will not, you could say, throw what they already have by way of an army and air force, the Navy is already pretty formidable, into Europe. I mean, Eberhard Jäckel has always felt that essentially this was a strategy which was essentially underpinned by the expectation that the Americans would have to divide their military and naval assets between two oceanic theaters. The problem is that he never bothered to explain why the Americans should do that. I mean, let's face it, the Philippines and Guam are goners anyway. So why not just turn your back on the Pacific, other than, say, to defend Australia, and essentially rush Europe with your freshly constituted army? Now, the only reason they wouldn't is because of natural rubber. 90% of the world's natural sourced rubber, more than 90%, comes from Southeast Asia in 1940. There is one nation on the planet that has a very well-developed synthetic rubber industry, and that country is Germany. The Americans have essentially botched this job. They have the same technology as Germany does. They should have been in a position to set up a synthetic rubber industry of their own, but they've basically failed to do so, and they're lagging behind badly. And this fact is known in Germany. Basically, the reports from the embassy in Washington are full about this, because this is a subject which is actually debated in a public forum again and again and again. And that basically means, if you're looking at this from Germany, that the Americans have to rush their half-ready army to Southeast Asia in order to retain at least part of the world, because otherwise they can turn out all the planes and jeeps and trucks they want, but they won't be able to put them on wheels, quite literally. And that is essentially the clincher. Yes, the Americans would have to commit to the Pacific if the war drags on there, because they need that rubber. Nobody is in a position to anticipate that American synthetic rubber production will go from 23,000 tons in 1942, which is totally inadequate, to 230,000 tons in 1943, which is a truly fantastic achievement, which frankly doesn't get the attention it warrants, because it's literally, it's a game-changing development. Okay, moving on. At the very heart of my argument is basically the Eastern Front. Why? Any general history of World War II any biography of Adolf Hitler. It will tell you that come December 5th, some authors will say it was December 6th, the Red Army counterattacked with 100 divisions across the entire breadth of Army Group Center outside Moscow, and that within days the Germans were squealing and you could say reeling back in horror, realizing they had lost the war. And it's against this backdrop, of course, that declaring war on the US does not make any sense at all. The thing is that basically, in order to make sense of these developments, you just have to get down and get dirty and, you could say, turn the war diaries of the three army groups upside down, which as far as I can make, nobody has done, and not in the context of examining this particular subject. And essentially, if you do that, a few interesting insights offer themselves. Number one, I mean, plenty of authors will insist that this was all about Moscow, that Hitler wanted Moscow, that essentially when his army came to a halt outside Moscow, he realized he had lost the war. And it's simply not true. Okay, we've got enough, just about enough utterances by Hitler on record from late October, early November 41, that basically say that he wants to engage in a process of retrenchment in the East. He wants the troops to start digging trenches as long as the soil is not yet frozen solid, and he wants to get ready for a spring campaign. And it's essentially, it's his army chief of staff, Halder, and the army's commander-in-chief, Brauchitsch, who basically drag him into a last-ditch commitment to try to go for Moscow, which is essentially a continuation of the Typhoon offensive. This particular operation, oddly enough, is never given a code name of its own. And it's an extremely poorly sourced operation. It's so poorly sourced that the individual armies essentially go into battle in a staggered fashion. It starts nominally on November 15th, but only one of the 6 armies committed actually crosses the line on that day. All the others are still essentially busy replenishing their stocks of fuel and ammunition. And Hitler's attitude towards this is basically, well, if you must, you must, but his heart is not really in it. And that is going to play a crucial role. In the first few days, 2 things are important to consider. For about a week, the Soviet counterattacks, and they really start on December 6th. December 5th, you have renewed fighting in the Kalinin sector up in the north of Army Group Center's perimeter. But Kalinin wouldn't have raised any red flags because they'd been fighting in and around Kalinin for weeks. So let's just settle for December 6th. The thing is that until about December 13th, you have Red Army counterattacks in separate sectors. You never have the Red Army counterattacking across the entire front. It's simply not true, and certainly not with 100 divisions. They counterattack here, they counterattack there. Whenever they can sense the Germans recoiling, they push a bit more. But essentially, these are still relatively small-scale attacks. They are almost opportunistic in nature. There is no sense of a general offensive there. And crucially, the Germans have been there before. They've done it, they've got the T-shirt, because they have essentially witnessed Red Army counterattacks on a far greater scale and of far greater ferocity outside Rostov, outside Yelnya, outside Staraya Russa, around August, September, October, and it's nothing new to them. In fact, most staff officers would have said, well, yeah, like I said, we've been there, and these guys can do a lot worse. I mean, these are just basically glorified probes. And it takes about at least 5 days, by my reckon, possibly 6, for Halder, Brauchitsch, and Fedor von Bock, who's the Army Group Center GOC, to connect the dots and basically say, oh, this is bad. this is bad, these guys are going from strength to strength, we need to think about something. What probably delays the whole thing by at least another day or two is the fact that nobody is terribly keen to turn around to their boss in Berlin and say, listen, you remember that operation we talked you into the other day, the one you weren't keen on at all? Yes. Well, it's going down the pan. It's going down the pan. It's going down the pan quite horribly. And we don't have any positions to retreat to. Our logistics are shot to pieces, and we're not quite sure what to do next. So it really is that sort of situation. You couldn't make it up. You couldn't make it up. It's basically the sort of situation where the generals botched the job, and after the war did a really quite a feat. I essentially somehow turning around the historical narrative to make sure that everybody blamed Hitler, who was easy to blame because nobody likes him very much anyway. Proof of this can be found, for instance, in a number of places, but there is a telephone conversation between Keitel and the Chief of Staff of Army Group North, which basically, and we've got minutes of this. I mean, the German Army Group war diaries, they are a motherload of information. I mean, they are a historian's dream. I mean, I rate them incredibly highly. This is December 7th. So according to most people's logic, this is like the third day of the Russian counteroffensive, the Russian counteroffensive that comes with 100 divisions, remember? And Keitel is discussing actually a fairly minor issue with the Chief of Staff of Army Group North about whether they should pull back from the Tichin Bulge or not. And he actually says in so many words, well, I was just talking to the Führer a moment ago, and we are both in agreement that this issue up there with Army Group North is the only critical issue in Russia right now. So whatever is happening outside Moscow, nobody seems to be paying any attention to it, or nobody seems to be rating it as a crisis. The penny finally drops around December 13th, when Hitler sends his trusted army ADC to Smolensk to confer with Bock, and then essentially he compares notes with what Brauchitsch and Halder have been telling him over the previous weeks, and then of course the proverbial really does hit the fan in quite a big way. And I'm convinced that when Brauchitsch got the sack after a big shouting match on December 19th, the subject of, shall we say, other decisions which Hitler had made in the meantime of the previous 8 days must have come up, because it's difficult to argue with the fact that Brauchitsch and Halder, because they first rushed him into, you could say, ill-judged operation, and then basically kept the implications for him for at least another 48 hours, so that he basically went ahead with a major grand strategic decision, which would ultimately do the Third Reich, something which he may even have realized, at least at a subconscious level. Okay, I think I still have a few minutes to address one or two more subjects. A Battle of the Atlantic comes to mind. I already mentioned the Battle of the Atlantic when discussing German-American relations. Now, the thing is that there is no proof, contrary to what you will read in most general histories, that essentially Hitler did feel sufficiently threatened by the US Navy's support for the Royal Navy in mid-Atlantic to declare war on them. There is simply no proof. There are utterances on record from him that appear to indicate this, but they are all from the post-December 11th period, not before. We do, however, have abundant proof from that period that basically says that he doesn't see the U-boats as a game changer. And in that light, the U-boats having their style a bit cramped by American intervention is not going to make him change his mind. And why doesn't he see the U-boats as a game changer? Well, he has some good reason for it. For one thing, there's never enough of them. Okay, their numbers stagnated around 30 to 35 for much of the 39-41 period, because they basically started the war with not nearly enough of them. And the training process is a quite laborious one. But then finally, in November 41, a corner is turned and they have like 85 on strength and more coming. And in a way, you can draw, you could say, support from that. You can actually tell yourself, okay, if I'm going to declare war on the US now and the entire Atlantic becomes a shooting gallery, I will at least find myself in this position, you could say, with a strong hand. Okay, by the time we reach Christmas, the U-boat arm would have reached 100 or so frontline U-boats. This does not include the establishment of the training flotillas. That's important to stress. So a major corner has been turned here. Then again, it hasn't, because things essentially will take a sudden and unexpected turn for the worse, because the winter of 39-41 was a very harsh one. And it basically meant that the Baltic more or less freezes up. And as most of you will know, the Baltic is the nursery for the U-boat arm. That's essentially where they train. And the U-boat training program pretty much collapses between January 42 and April 42. First of all, you could say it goes down, then it pretty much seizes up. And by May of 42, they are short by about 45 U-boats, which is big. By that time, they could have had like 150 U-boats, essentially patrolling the North Atlantic sea lanes, which would have made a big difference, because keep in mind that around this time, Bletchley Park was blacked out. So in a way, you could say we have a development here, which basically is broadly similar to what happens on the Eastern Front. Come December 11th, 1942, things are actually fine and dandy. There is essentially no indication of a major disaster on the horizon. A couple of weeks later, completely different story. Finally, and there's a couple of subjects I could still touch on. I think I'll go for the Air Force, because I'm a plane spotter. As Garth will remember, I'm the departmental plane spotter. And basically what is important to consider is that the Luftwaffe in 1941 has 3 new next generation aircraft in the pipeline, which are basically rated as very, very, very important. And 2 of these, the Messerschmitt 210 heavy fighter and the Heinkel 177 strategic bomber, are basically all ready to go on the day Germany declares war on the United States. So essentially, it's another big fat tick in the right box. But as you know, well, the plane spotters among you, because the fellow plane spotters among you will know, is that what happens is that only a couple of months later, the Messerschmitt 210 and then the Heinkel 177 turn out to be absolute death traps for their crews, because their design is crucially flawed in a number of ways. And the Messerschmitt 210, in fact, is terminated and pulled from service, which is something that is unique to German military history. For a weapon system of this complexity, such importance, to have you could say, to have the plug pulled on it. Unique until a couple of years ago, until the Bundesmarine basically returned the Baden-Württemberg frigate to daddy, as it were. So essentially the Messerschmitt 210 case is no longer unique in the history of the German armed forces. We've got the present day Baden-Württemberg frigate to keep it company. But basically, again, you see the same pattern emerging here. Basically, we have a situation where the German leader, as he drives to the Kroll Opera to deliver his declaration of war, takes stock of the general situation as far as he can see. He's doing so from a position of strength. There are no obvious liabilities. There are no obvious Achilles heels. Things are humming along nicely. Not perfect in all areas, but good enough for government work. On top of which, you're dealing with a highly temperamental and erratic Japanese ally who has finally made a firm commitment to joining the war, but he's absolutely insistent that you hold their hand, because other than that, they might just jump ship again, because the Japanese are known for doing the most unexpected things at the least convenient of times. So basically, you need to jump through this window of opportunity. And I would love to claim that essentially I was able to connect all these dots by upseiling one night into some secret KGB archive and essentially plunder it before sunup. But no, I mean, I did find a few news sources, but most of these were available, have been freely available since the 1960s. And I would put it to you that basically the people who came before me and essentially gave a shot at examining this subject were not military historians. And that's essentially what you need for this particular subject. You need a military historians. The people who came before me were Third Reich historians, possibly even Second World War historians, but not military historians. And essentially this is, I could say, a question you can only answer by really getting down and getting dirty with the nitty-gritty of the military machine of the Third Reich, as it was in 1941. A military machine which is literally months away from starting to seize up. But it's not obvious to most people in early December 1941. Many thanks.